Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a Spartan military camp just before dawn, when the sky is still undecided and the stars haven't quite clocked out yet. You're padding forward in borrowed sandals that slap a little louder than you'd like, feeling the chill of packed earth rise through your soles while the camp breathes in its sleep. Somewhere nearby, a sentry clears his throat, the ancient equivalent of a notification sound, and you realize, yes, you probably won't survive this if comfort is your love language. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and local time. Insomniacs of the world, unite quietly. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a Spartan camp in the early 5th century BCE, when discipline is less a concept and more a lifestyle choice forced on everyone before breakfast. The first thing you notice is how little there is. No ornate tents, no clutter, no live, laugh, love plaques nailed to anything. This tracks with a mainstream historical fact. Spartans famously rejected luxury, believing austerity built stronger soldiers. Even their camps mirrored this philosophy, arranged with efficiency instead of flair. You're here to share pre-dawn bread with the sentries, a ritual that's less about hunger and more about solidarity. The bread is barley-based, dense enough to double as a weapon in an emergency. You break off a piece, chew slowly, and think, wow, this makes modern protein bars feel like dessert. One of the guards raises an eyebrow at you, not hostile, just curious, and you both agree silently that no one eats this for fun. That's joke one. You'll pace yourself. The air smells faintly of ash and wool. Cloaks are wrapped tight, and shields rest upright in the dirt like sleepy metal turtles. A quirky tidbit drifts through your mind. Some ancient writers claimed Spartans trained themselves to endure hunger so well that stealing food was encouraged as long as you didn't get caught. Getting caught meant punishment, not for stealing, but for being bad at it. Even now, historians still argue whether these accounts reflect reality or later exaggerations meant to dramatize Spartan toughness. A sentry shifts his weight beside you, spear tip scraping softly against stone. You match his stillness, sharing the bread in companionable silence. Joke 2 sneaks in when you realize this is the quietest breakfast you've ever had. No chatter, no clinking dishes, just chewing and existential resolve. Joke 3 follows when your stomach politely asks for coffee and is immediately ignored, like a weak suggestion in a group chat. Above you, the sky begins to pale. Dawn is coming, but for now, you stay here, breathing slowly, learning how patience tastes when it's baked into bread. The cold earth presses back through your sandals, and now that you've stopped moving, you really feel it, this steady, grounding chill that seeps upward and reminds you that the Spartans never planned for comfort, only for readiness. You shift your weight slightly, then stop yourself, realizing even small fidgets feel loud out here. The camp is quiet in a way that modern silence never is. No engines, no distant sirens, just breath, wind, and the faint crackle of a dying fire. You glance down and notice how worn the sandals are. Leather straps, simple soles, nothing decorative. A mainstream historical fact floats gently into place. Spartan footwear was deliberately minimal, sometimes worn year-round, because exposure was believed to harden the body and discipline the mind. You briefly imagine explaining this to your feet on a cold morning walk today. They would file a formal complaint. The sentries nearby stand like silhouettes cut from the dark. Their cloaks are pulled tight, and their shadows stretch long across the ground as the firelight flickers. One of them subtly adjusts his grip on the spear, a movement practiced enough to be almost unconscious. You copy the stillness again, even though no one asked you to. It just feels right, like whispering in a library you didn't know existed. There's a smell in the air. Smoke, yes, but also damp earth and wool, with a faint hint of yesterday's lentil stew clinging stubbornly to everything. A quirky tidbit slips in.
Ancient camps often reused fire pits night after night, which meant aromas layered over time, creating quiet little scent histories no one ever wrote down. Historians still argue whether soldiers grew comforted by these familiar smells or simply stopped noticing them altogether. A guard near you exhales slowly through his nose, fogging the air just a little. You realize everyone here is counting time not by clocks, but by sensations, the ache in legs, the cooling of ashes, the sky's gradual shift from ink to charcoal. Joke 1 arrives when you think this is basically mindfulness with spears and significantly fewer scented candles. Your hands feel stiff, so you tuck them into your sleeves, hoping no one interprets this as weakness. Spartan culture prized endurance, but it also understood practicality. Another accepted fact surfaces. Spartans trained from youth to withstand cold and fatigue, believing shared hardship built unity. Standing here now, you get it, not as a slogan, but as a lived, slightly uncomfortable truth. Somewhere beyond the tents, an owl calls once, then goes quiet. Joke 2 whispers through your thoughts. Even the wildlife seems to know this is not the time for conversation. Joke 3 follows when your brain briefly suggests stretching, then immediately abandons the idea. You breathe in, slow and steady, letting the cold anchor you. The camp remains still, and so do you, learning how silence feels when it's worn like armor. You start to notice the people who actually own this hour, the sentries themselves. They're spaced just far enough apart to see one another, close enough that no gap feels careless. You stand among them now, an extra shadow that hasn't quite earned its place, but hasn't been chased away either. The watch belongs to adult Spartan citizens, men who have completed the agoge, the state-run training system that shaped them from childhood into soldiers. That's a mainstream historical fact, and you can feel the weight of it in how little they move, how nothing about their posture looks accidental. One sentry shifts his stance, rolling his shoulders once, slow and controlled. You mirror him a second later and immediately regret it. Your joints respond with a tiny protest. You swallow the sound. Joke 1 lands softly. Congratulations, you've just failed a Spartan pop quiz on silence.
Their faces are hard to see, but you sense their attention moving constantly, scanning the edges of the camp, the darker patches between tents, the low hills beyond. Night watch isn't glamorous. It's repetitive, quiet, and heavy with responsibility. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some ancient sources suggest Spartans practiced standing nearly motionless for long periods as a form of discipline, almost like a military version of extreme patience training. Historians still argue whether this was a formal drill or simply a reputation that grew over time because no one ever caught a Spartan fidgeting. One of the guards glances your way and nods once, just enough to acknowledge you without inviting conversation. You nod back, instantly wondering if that was too enthusiastic. Joke 2, you've just over-nodded in ancient Greece and there's no undo button. The sentries rotate through the night in shifts, measured not by bells, but by internal rhythm and quiet signals. This matters because a tired guard is a dangerous liability. Another accepted fact settles in. Spartan military success relied heavily on cohesion and vigilance rather than surprise tactics alone. Watching these men, you understand how that vigilance is built, slowly, nightly, through habits that leave no room for sloppiness. A faint breeze passes through the camp, stirring the edges of cloaks. One sentry tightens his grip on the spear, not out of fear, but reflex. Fear exists here, but it's managed, folded inward. Joke 3 hums gently when you realize this is the most emotionally controlled group you've ever stood with, and no one has once asked how anyone's doing. You break another piece of barley bread and offer it down the line. The gesture is accepted with a brief glance, a shared chew, no words exchanged. Food, like silence, is practical here. As you stand watch with them, the darkness begins to thin, and you sense that the camp trusts these quiet figures completely, because they've learned to trust themselves first. The bread feels heavier now, not in your hands, but in meaning, as if sharing it has quietly promoted you from guest to participant. You pass another piece along, and this time it's taken without even a glance, the motion smooth and practiced. Barley bread is the staple here, a mainstream historical fact that shows up again and again in accounts of Spartan diet. Wheat was considered softer, indulgent. Barley was fuel. You chew slowly, jaw working like it's been assigned a task rather than a pleasure. The texture is rough, almost sandy, and you briefly wonder if dental care was also part of Spartan training. Joke 1 lands gently. Somewhere in the future, a dentist is shaking his head in disappointment across time. Still, the bread does its job. It fills the mouth, steadies the stomach, and gives you something to focus on besides the cold. Eating before sunrise isn't about hunger alone, it's about readiness. A sentry beside you takes a bite, swallows, then resumes scanning the darkness without missing a beat. Food and duty overlap here in a way that feels very Spartan. No pause, no ceremony. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some ancient writers claimed Spartans deliberately under-seasoned their food to avoid distraction, believing strong flavors softened discipline. Historians still argue whether this was strict practice or philosophical branding after the fact. You listen to the sound of chewing, muted, careful, almost respectful. No one rushes, no one lingers. Joke 2 slips in when you realize this is the exact opposite of modern breakfast culture, where eating usually involves scrolling, spilling, and regret. Here, even crumbs seem to behave themselves. The sky lightens another shade, the darkness retreating slowly, like it's reluctant to leave such a well-guarded place. A thin line of pale gray forms at the horizon. One of the sentries shifts his spear from one hand to the other, testing circulation. You do the same with the bread, mostly to keep your fingers from stiffening. You're learning that everything here serves multiple purposes: warmth, focus, habit. Another known fact settles in. Spartan meals were often communal, reinforcing equality among citizens. Rank mattered less around shared food than shared duty. Standing here, sharing this simple bread, you feel that flattening effect. No speeches, no hierarchy announcements, just bodies in the cold, chewing together before the day begins. Joke 3 hums quietly when you realize this might be the most meaningful breakfast you've ever had, and it cost approximately 0 calories of joy. As the final crumbs disappear, you brush your hands together softly, careful not to break the spell of the hour. Dawn is closer now, but for the moment, the watch continues steady and unbroken. Once the bread is gone, the silence feels fuller, like it's settled in because there's nothing left to interrupt it. You become aware of how eating here follows unspoken rules: no talking, no reacting, no little sounds of approval. The Spartans treat food the same way they treat orders, efficiently, without commentary. This lines up with a mainstream historical fact. Spartan society discouraged expressive behavior, believing restraint was a form of strength. Even enjoyment, apparently, was expected to keep a low profile. You wipe your hands on your cloak, slow and deliberate. A sentry nearby does the same, mirroring you by coincidence or habit, it's hard to tell. For a moment, you feel oddly synchronized, like part of a very quiet choreography. Joke 1 drifts in. This is the least dramatic meal in human history, and somehow that's the point. The camp itself seems to respect these silent rules. Fires burn low, carefully maintained to give light without spectacle. Tents remain closed, their occupants still asleep, trusting the watch to hold the edges of the night together. A quirky tidbit fronts up. Some ancient sources suggest Spartan camps avoided excessive torchlight to preserve night vision and reduce detection. Historians still argue whether this was a tactical rule or simply a natural extension of their no-frills mindset. A guard shifts closer to the fire, extending his hands briefly towards the warmth before pulling them back, as if even comfort must be rationed. You follow suit, then quickly retreat, worried you've lingered too long. Joke 2 lands when you realize you're self-policing your own coziness. That's Sparta for you, rent-free in your head. Silence here isn't awkward, it's functional. You sense how it sharpens hearing, how every small sound, a footstep, a breath, the soft creak of leather becomes meaningful. Another established fact settles in. Spartan military training emphasized awareness and discipline over individual expression. Watching the sentries, you understand how that training lives on in moments like this, long after the drills end. The sky continues its slow transformation, stars fading one by one. Someone coughs quietly into their cloak, apologetic without saying so. Joke 3 hums gently when you think this is probably the only place where even coughing feels like breaking curfew. You breathe in, matching the rhythm around you, letting the quiet guide your movements. The rules aren't written anywhere, but you feel them all the same, woven into the air. As the night watch holds steady, you realize that silence here isn't emptiness, it's structure, holding everyone in place until the camp is ready to wake.
Time moves differently now, stretched thin like the last embers in the fire. You begin to notice the rhythm of the night watches, not announced, not marked, but felt. One sentry subtly steps back, another steps forward, and somehow the perimeter remains intact without a word exchanged. This quiet smina, this changing of the guard, is as smooth as breathing. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Spartan camps relied on rotating watches throughout the night to prevent fatigue, because exhaustion, not enemies, was often the real threat. You track the movement with your eyes, careful not to stare. The guards know exactly when to shift, guided by habit and an internal clock sharpened by years of repetition. Joke 1 drifts in when you realize these men don't need alarms, reminders, or a motivational podcast to stay on task. Their circadian rhythm could probably bench press yours. The fire crackles softly, then stills again, like it's aware of the rules. A sentry kneels to adjust a piece of wood, just enough to keep the glow alive. Too bright would be wasteful, too dim would be careless. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some ancient military thinkers believed fire itself could betray a camp's discipline, revealing sloppiness in how soldiers managed light and heat. Historians still argue whether Spartans consciously followed such theories or simply embodied them without formal doctrine. You shift your stance, copying the sentry's slow alternation of pressure from foot to foot. It's not rest exactly, but it keeps blood moving. Joke 2 hums quietly when you realize you've accidentally joined an ancient low-impact workout program. No membership fee, just eternal vigilance. The night air feels thinner now, cooler somehow, as if dawn is drawing it upward. One guard murmurs a brief phrase, too low to catch, maybe a signal, maybe a habit. You don't ask. Words here are tools, not decorations. Another accepted fact floats in. Spartan communication favored brevity, giving rise to the term laconic, named for their homeland, Laconia. Standing among them, you understand why long explanations would feel out of place. An owl glides overhead and disappears. No one reacts. Joke 3 settles in when you realize you're the only one who noticed, and even you didn't gasp. Personal growth, Spartan style. As the watch turns again, you feel the night loosening its grip. The camp remains asleep, held together by these quiet exchanges and practiced movements. You stay where you are, breathing slowly, learning how vigilance can be gentle when it's shared. With the watch settling into its next quiet phase, your attention drifts to what rests beside the sentries rather than what they hold. Armor lies stacked neatly near the tents, bronze shields leaned at careful angles, spears grounded with their tips protected, helmets turned on their sides like sleeping animals. Nothing is scattered, nothing is decorative. A mainstream historical fact fits here easily. Spartan equipment was standardized and intentionally plain, meant to function as part of the unit rather than an extension of individual identity. You crouch slightly, just enough to study a shield without touching it. The bronze surface is dull, not polished for display, and bears marks of use, small dents, shallow scratches. Joke 1 hums when you think this is the ancient equivalent of tools, not toys, and you feel mildly judged for ever owning anything purely aesthetic. A sentry notices your interest and gives a subtle nod, permission without ceremony. You straighten again, respecting the boundary. The gear waits patiently, as if it understands it will be needed soon enough. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some ancient accounts suggest Spartans slept close to their weapons, believing physical proximity reinforced mental readiness. Historians still argue whether this was literal practice or symbolic language meant to emphasize constant preparedness. Cloaks are draped over shields to keep the night damp from settling on the metal. You hadn't considered moisture as an enemy, but here it's treated with the same seriousness as any opposing force. Joke 2 arrives softly when you realize this camp probably has fewer rust problems than most modern garages. The air smells faintly metallic near the armor, mixing with smoke and wool. You breathe it in and imagine the weight of these objects once they're lifted, strapped on, brought to life. Another accepted fact settles in. Spartan hoplites fought in tight formation, relying on their shields to protect not just themselves, but the man beside them. Seeing the shields rest, you understand how much trust is built into their very design. One helmet catches a bit of growing light, reflecting a pale glow onto the ground. It's not dramatic, more like a quiet reminder. Joke 3 slips in when you think even the armor seems too disciplined to shine unnecessarily. The sentries remain alert but relaxed in their own severe way. Weapons rest, but they are never forgotten. You sense how this balance between readiness and restraint defines the camp. As dawn creeps closer, the equipment waits alongside you, silent and patient, part of the same shared pause before the day demands more. As the light grows, you start to feel the full shape of Spartan discipline pressing in, not as something loud or aggressive, but as an absence of softness. There are no cushions, no extra blankets, no little allowances made for comfort's sake. The ground is the ground, the air is the air. A mainstream historical fact fits here neatly. Spartans deliberately avoided luxury in daily life, believing that comfort weakened both body and character. You adjust your cloak, then stop halfway, realizing the sentries haven't moved theirs in a while. You let it be. Joke 1 drifts in when you think this place could cure anyone of being a high-maintenance sleeper in about 5 minutes flat. Even the fire is disciplined now, reduced to a careful glow. Too much warmth would invite relaxation, and relaxation is suspicious. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some later writers claimed Spartans trained themselves to endure cold nights with minimal covering to prepare for campaign hardships. Historians still argue whether such extremes were universal practice or selectively remembered to reinforce a cultural ideal. You notice the way the sentries stand, balanced, efficient, no wasted motion. They don't lean, don't slouch, don't stretch unless it serves a purpose. Discipline here isn't shouted, it's embodied. Another accepted fact settles in. Spartan society was structured to prioritize collective strength over individual comfort, from childhood training to adult military life. Watching these men, you understand how that priority becomes second nature. A breeze passes through, sharp enough to raise goosebumps. You inhale slowly, steadying yourself. Joke 2 hums when you realize your modern instinct is to complain internally, while theirs is to simply not. No commentary, no drama. Somewhere deeper in the camp, a sleeper turns over, the faint rustle of cloak on earth carrying surprisingly far in the quiet. No one reacts. The sentries trust their perimeter, trust each other. Joke 3 arrives gently when you realize this trust feels heavier than any blanket could be. As the horizon lightens again, colors shifting from gray to pale blue, you feel alert despite the hour, tuned in by the austerity around you. There's a strange clarity that comes with having nothing to distract you, not even comfort. As you stand there, sharing this stripped-down moment, you sense how Spartan discipline isn't about denying humanity, but about focusing it, narrowing life down to what matters until dawn says otherwise. In this stripped-down quiet, humor arrives in unusual ways, thin, dry, and whispered, like everything else here. You catch it not in laughter, but in glances, in the smallest lift of an eyebrow. Spartan humor, when it appears, is famously brief. A mainstream historical fact supports this. Spartans were known for their sharp, concise wit, often delivering cutting remarks in as few words as possible. Comedy, like everything else, was expected to pull its weight.
A sentry near you murmurs something under his breath, just enough for the man beside him to hear. There's a pause, then a barely there exhale through the nose. No smile, no sound. Joke 1 lands when you realize you've just witnessed an ancient stand-up routine with a runtime of half a second. You lean slightly closer, curious but careful. The exchange isn't meant for you, and that's fine. Humor here functions like seasoning, used sparingly, appreciated quietly. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some recorded Spartan sayings were so blunt that later writers turned them into moral anecdotes, possibly exaggerating the sharpness for effect. Historians still argue whether these remarks reflect everyday speech or were polished over time into philosophical soundbites. Another sentry adjusts his cloak and mutters something about the cold. The response comes back immediately, dry and efficient. You don't catch the words, but you catch the tone. Joke 2 hums when you realize this is the ancient equivalent of complaining, Spartan style. Acknowledge discomfort once, then move on. The sky brightens enough now that you can make out faces more clearly. Lines of fatigue, yes, but also familiarity. These men have stood together like this many times before. Another accepted fact settles in. Spartan units trained and lived together for years, fostering deep bonds that went beyond formal hierarchy. Humor, even minimal humor, is part of that bond. You suppress a smile when you notice a sentry glance at the fire, then at the sky, then back at the fire, as if negotiating silently with dawn. Joke 3 slips in when you think he's mentally bargaining for 5 more minutes of night, a feeling that transcends centuries. No one laughs out loud, no one needs to. The humor does its work quietly, easing tension without breaking focus. You feel it too, a subtle lightness under the discipline. As the camp edges closer to waking, these small moments remind you that even in Sparta, humanity finds a way to whisper through the rules. Even now, with dawn pressing closer, you sense that training never really stops here. There's no clear line between practice and real life. Everything is practice. The way sentries stand, breathe, scan the horizon, it's all rehearsal for moments when it will matter more. A mainstream historical fact fits neatly here. Spartan military training emphasized constant readiness, with drills designed to make correct reactions automatic rather than thoughtful. You notice a guard subtly testing the balance of his spear, rolling it once in his palm, then stilling it again. Another shifts his footing to relieve pressure, then locks back into place. These micro-movements feel practiced, intentional. Joke 1 drifts in when you realize this camp could turn standing around into an Olympic event. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some ancient writers claimed Spartans trained themselves to remain calm under extreme stress by rehearsing in deliberately uncomfortable conditions: cold, hunger, fatigue. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect standardized methods or were later interpretations layered onto a culture already known for toughness. The light now reveals the outlines of nearby hills, soft and undramatic. No enemy shapes, no sudden threats. Still, no one relaxes. Another accepted fact settles in. Spartan success relied heavily on discipline and cohesion rather than superior numbers or technology. Watching the sentries, you understand how cohesion is built, not in battle, but in moments like this, repeated night after night. You shift your shoulders, easing tension, and immediately catch yourself. You slow the movement, make it quieter. Joke 2 hums when you realize you've adopted Spartan self-surveillance. Your inner critic is now wearing a cloak and holding a spear. A faint bird call breaks the silence, then another. The sentries don't react, but you feel the change. Dawn is no longer a concept, it's happening. Joke 3 slips in when you think even the birds seem hesitant, like they're waiting for permission. One guard takes a deeper breath, steady and controlled. You match it, feeling oddly grounded. Training, you realize, isn't just about muscles or drills. It's about shaping how time feels, how discomfort is processed, how attention is held. Standing here, sharing this threshold between night and day, you sense how Spartan training lives on in every quiet habit long after the formal lessons end. Fear doesn't announce itself here. It doesn't shout or shake or demand attention. It arrives quietly, if it arrives at all, and then it's folded away just as quietly. Standing with the sentries, you sense it as a low background hum rather than a spike. A mainstream historical fact fits gently into place here. Spartan culture emphasized emotional control, training soldiers to manage fear rather than eliminate it, because fear, unmanaged, was a liability to the group. You notice how eyes move, slow, deliberate, never darting. Each sentry scans the darkness with patience, not urgency.
There's trust in the system, in the spacing, in the man beside them. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some ancient sources suggest Spartans trained themselves to believe fear was contagious, spreading faster than courage if allowed to show. Historians still argue whether this belief shaped formal training or simply reflected an intuitive understanding of group psychology. A faint bird call breaks the silence, then another. The sentries don't react, but you feel the change. Dawn is no longer a concept, it's happening. Joke 3 slips in when you think even the birds seem hesitant, like they're waiting for permission. One guard takes a deeper breath, steady and controlled. You match it, feeling oddly grounded. Training, you realize, isn't just about muscles or drills. It's about shaping how time feels, how discomfort is processed, how attention is held. Standing here, sharing this threshold between night and day, you sense how Spartan training lives on in every quiet habit long after the formal lessons end. Fear doesn't announce itself here. It doesn't shout or shake or demand attention. It arrives quietly, if it arrives at all, and then it's folded away just as quietly. Standing with the sentries, you sense it as a low background hum rather than a spike. A mainstream historical fact fits gently into place here. Spartan culture emphasized emotional control, training soldiers to manage fear rather than eliminate it, because fear, unmanaged, was a liability to the group. You notice how eyes move, slow, deliberate, never darting. Each sentry scans the darkness with patience, not urgency. There's trust in the system, in the spacing, in the man beside them. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some ancient sources suggest Spartans trained themselves to believe fear was contagious, spreading faster than courage if allowed to show. Historians still argue whether this belief shaped formal training or simply reflected an intuitive understanding of group psychology. A faint bird call breaks the silence, then another. The sentries don't react, but you feel the change. Dawn is no longer a concept, it's happening. Joke 3 slips in when you think even the birds seem hesitant, like they're waiting for permission. One guard takes a deeper breath, steady and controlled. You match it, feeling oddly grounded. Training, you realize, isn't just about muscles or drills. It's about shaping how time feels, how discomfort is processed, how attention is held. Standing here, sharing this threshold between night and day, you sense how Spartan training lives on in every quiet habit long after the formal lessons end. When the bread comes back into your thoughts, it's no longer about hunger at all. It's about connection. The simple act of breaking and sharing it has stitched you, briefly, into the fabric of this watch. A mainstream historical fact fits easily here. Spartan meals, especially within military contexts, were meant to reinforce equality and collective identity rather than individual status. Food was function, but it was also glue.
You glance down the line of sentries, each standing apart yet linked by routine and trust. The earlier exchange of bread feels like a quiet handshake that needed no follow-up. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some ancient writers described Spartan communal eating as one of the strongest tools for maintaining loyalty, even claiming that soldiers felt more accountable to those they ate with than to abstract laws. Historians still argue whether this reflects lived reality or later idealization of Spartan unity. A sentry beside you clears his throat softly, the sound nearly swallowed by the air. You recognize it now, not as impatience but as presence. Joke 1 hums when you realize this camp has mastered the art of being there without ever announcing it. The light grows steadier, revealing more detail. The grain of wooden spear shafts, the stitching on cloaks, the dust settled into everything. You feel less like an outsider now, less like you're intruding on something private. Another accepted fact settles in. Spartan military units lived and trained together for long periods, creating bonds that blurred the line between personal and collective survival. Sharing food, even something as plain as barley bread, reinforced those bonds daily. You imagine how many mornings like this these men have shared. Different nights, same ritual. Joke 2 arrives gently when you realize this makes the bread less of a snack and more of a recurring character in their lives. Reliable, quiet, always on time. One sentry shifts, offering you the faintest nod, almost imperceptible. It's not thanks, not approval, just acknowledgement. Joke 3 follows when you realize this nod might be the highest honor you'll receive before sunrise. As the camp edges closer to waking, you feel the subtle pull of routine drawing everyone forward. The bread is gone, but its effect lingers, binding the watch together until the first movements of the day break the spell of the night. The first signs of waking ripple outward, barely noticeable at first. A cough from within a tent, the soft scrape of a body shifting on packed earth. You hear it before you fully register it, like the camp exhaling after holding its breath all night. A mainstream historical fact fits smoothly here. Spartan camps rose early, with daily routines beginning at dawn to reinforce discipline and readiness. The sentries don't relax yet, not quite. They hold their positions as the boundary between night and day thins to almost nothing. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Some ancient accounts suggest Spartan camps avoided loud wake-up calls, preferring natural cues like light and movement to signal the start of the day. Historians still argue whether this was standard practice or an idealized image of Spartan restraint. A tent flap lifts slightly, then falls back into place. Someone inside mutters, low, groggy, human. Joke 1 hums when you realize even legendary warriors sound exactly like modern people before coffee. The sky now carries a soft blue wash, and the hills stand clearly against it. Shadows shorten, details sharpen. You notice how the sentries subtly widen their stance, preparing to hand the perimeter back to the waking camp. Another accepted fact settles in. Spartan military life relied on smooth transitions of responsibility, ensuring no moment of vulnerability during shifts between rest and activity. You feel your own alertness spike, like your body knows the night phase is ending. Joke 2 slips in when you realize this is the most productive you felt at dawn without having accomplished anything measurable. A low murmur begins to spread, not conversation exactly, more like the sound of life resuming. The fire is stirred, just enough to brighten. One sentry finally allows himself a deeper stretch, brief and controlled. Joke 3 lands gently when you think this counts as a full Spartan spa day. The watch is nearly over. You sense it not through command, but through atmosphere. The camp is waking, and the quiet, disciplined bubble of the night watch begins to dissolve. Still, no one rushes. Everything unfolds at the same measured pace that held the darkness at bay. You remain where you are, absorbing the last moments of this shared stillness before daylight fully takes over. With daylight now firmly taking hold, your thoughts drift outward, beyond the camp itself, toward the stories told about places like this. What you've experienced feels grounded, human, practical, yet so much of what we think we know about Spartans comes filtered through admiration, fear, or outright myth-making. A mainstream historical fact sits at the center of this. Much of our knowledge about Sparta comes from non-Spartan writers, often Athenians who observed from the outside. You look around at the camp, its plainness, its routines, its quiet competence, and wonder how much has been exaggerated over time. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some ancient authors described Spartans as almost superhuman in endurance, while others painted them as overly rigid and joyless. Historians still argue whether Sparta was truly as extreme as later sources suggest, or whether everyday life included more flexibility than the legend allows. A soldier beside you passes behind you, carrying a water vessel, careful not to slosh it. No ceremony, no drama. It feels ordinary, and that ordinariness itself challenges the myths. Joke 1 hums when you realize history might be guilty of over-editing, trimming out all the boring parts, ironically the very parts that make this moment feel real. You think back to the night watch, the bread, the silence, the small exchanges, and recognize how easily such moments disappear from grand narratives. Another accepted fact settles in. Historians often struggle to reconstruct daily life in ancient military camps because routine rarely leaves dramatic records. What survives are laws, battles, and speeches, not pre-dawn meals and quiet vigilance. A sentry from earlier finally steps away, his duty complete, blending seamlessly into the waking camp. Joke 2 slips in when you realize no one applauds, no one says, "Good job." The reward is simply being done.
The camp now hums softly with life. You sense how scholarship itself mirrors this place. Layers of interpretation laid over sparse evidence, scholars standing watch over fragments of the past. Joke 3 arrives gently when you imagine historians arguing politely over barley bread while the real Spartans quietly eat it and move on. Standing here, you accept that some details will always remain uncertain, and somehow that uncertainty feels fitting. The camp doesn't explain itself, it just exists, steady and unassuming, as daylight completes its slow, inevitable takeover.
The night watch dissolves without announcement. One moment you are still standing in that narrow space between darkness and morning, and the next, the camp has fully claimed the day. The sentries ease back, their duty complete, not with relief, but with a quiet acceptance that another task simply replaces the last. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Spartan daily life followed a strict rhythm where military readiness blended seamlessly into training, meals, and communal responsibilities. You step slightly aside now, no longer part of the perimeter, watching the camp move with low, efficient energy. Tents open, fires are coaxed back to life. Someone stretches, another ties a sandal strap. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Ancient writers sometimes noted that Spartan mornings were intentionally unceremonious, avoiding dramatic signals to reinforce steadiness rather than excitement. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate policy or simply the natural result of a culture that disliked fuss. The sun crests the hills at last, light spilling across shields and earth alike. You feel its warmth brush your face, subtle but reassuring. Joke 1 hums softly when you realize this is the closest thing to a Spartan good morning, and it doesn't come with words. You breathe out, slowly, letting your shoulders drop for the first time in hours. The tension that held you alert all night loosens. Joke 2 arrives when you notice how deeply satisfying that small release feels, like finally putting down a heavy backpack you forgot you were wearing. A soldier passes you and offers a brief nod, the same quiet acknowledgement from earlier, now transformed into closure. Joke 3 slips in when you realize this might be your entire Spartan farewell ceremony. Efficient, minimal, done. As the camp settles into its daytime rhythm, you remain still for a moment longer, holding on to the memory of the watch, the bread, the silence, the shared patience. Then you let it go, trusting the day to take care of itself the way the night did. And now, as everything softens, your thoughts can soften too. The light is steady, the sounds are gentle and predictable. Breathing slows, deepens. You're no longer standing watch, you're simply resting in the afterglow of having been there. The camp fades from sharp detail into a calm impression, earth tones, quiet movement, warm air. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to stay alert. Let the discipline, the stillness, the shared calm drift away from you like smoke thinning into the morning sky. There is nothing to guard now, nothing to prepare for. Just rest. Let your breathing slow. Let the edges of the scene blur. Let sleep arrive the way dawn did, gently, without command.